So today we're going to talk about solving quadratics by factoring. So let's go ahead and get started. This is something that is review we talked about already before we were sent home from school for the stay-at-home order. So I thought it would be good to review it before we move on to the other topics within quadratics. So we're going to start again by reviewing what a quadratic solution is. So the solution to a quadratic function is just called the zero of that function, and the zero is just simply the x-intercept. So it's just where that graph crosses the x-axis. And we talked a little bit about how it can cross it at one place, at one point where the vertex is sitting on the x-axis, or it can cross it at two places where the vertex is sitting either above or below, depending on which way it opens up, and it crosses twice, or it doesn't cross it at all. So its vertex is above the x-axis and it opens up, or the vertex is below the x-axis and it opens down and it doesn't cross at all. And we'll talk more about those type of solutions in a future lesson. So the first thing that we need to remember is that anything multiplied by 0 equals 0. We've known that for a long time. So if I'm going to get 0 when I multiply, something has to be 0. So let's take a look at what that looks like with quadratics. So here's one that's already in factored form. So if I have x minus 3 times the quantity x plus 2 equals 0, what's the value of x? Well, I really only have two things that are being multiplied together. There's the first one, and there's the second one. So one of those two things has to be 0. So I just look at, well, either x minus 3 equals 0 or x plus 2 equals 0, and I use my equation solving strategies. On the first one, I add 3 to both sides and I get x equals 3, or I subtract 2 from both sides of the second equation and I get x equals negative 2. So the solution, or the zeros of this function, are x equals 3 or x equals negative 2. Let's look at another example. So here's example 2. Again, I just have two things that are being multiplied together. There's the first one, there's the second one. So one of those two things has to equal 0. So x plus 4 equals 0 or x plus 6 equals 0. I use my simple equation solving strategies. On the first one, I subtract 4 from both sides and I get x equals negative 4. Or in the second equation, I subtract 6 from both sides and I get x equals negative 6. So the zeros of this quadratic function are x equals negative 4 or x equals negative 6. Example 3. This one's a little bit different. It's still two numbers that are being multiplied together, but the equation is a little bit more complex than it was before. So I have either 2x minus 4 equals 0 or x minus 5 equals 0. Not really too much more complicated to solve. I'm going to use my equation solving strategies. So on the first equation, I'm going to add 4 to both sides and I get 2x equals 4, but I have to do one more step. I have to divide by 2, and when I do that I get x equals 2 because 4 divided by 2 is 2. And then I go over to the other side, the other equation, and I just have to add 5 to both sides, so I get x equals 5. So the zeros for this equation are x equals 2 or x equals 5. And let's look at one more. So again, I just have two things that are being multiplied together, and I know one of those two things has to equal 0. So I say, okay, well, 3x minus 2 either equals 0 or 2x plus 5 equals 0. So I use my equation solving strategies. The first equation, I add 2 to both sides, I get 3x equals 2, and then I have to divide by 3. And since I can't divide 2 by 3, I leave it as a fraction. So x equals 2/3. And I go over here and do the same thing for the other equation. I subtract 5 from both sides. I get 2x equals negative 5. And then I divide by 2. Since 5 can't be divided by 2, I leave it as negative 5/2. And I just pulled that negative out in front. You can leave it with the 5 if you want, but usually if one of the numbers is negative, we just make the whole fraction negative. All right, so now let's take a look at how do we get it to that factored form, because that's not how we're usually given the equation. So here's one for example. Solve by factoring x squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0. And I've already put the answers down there for you, but I want to show you how we get to those answers. So this is what I call the box method. This box method is amazing for all different kinds of math, and so we're going to use that to help us factor quadratics. So the key thing is to remember to put the first term in the first box, that upper left-hand box, and we're going to put the last term in that lower right-hand box. So I have x squared and then I have minus 3. Now I come over here to the other side, I make this t-chart, and I multiply those two things together, the two x squared minus the 3. So x squared times negative 3 is negative 3x squared. So what I want to look at are the factors of 3. What numbers multiply together to give me 3? Well, this is an easy one because the only way that we can get 3 when we multiply is 1x times 3x. That will give me the x squared. So now what I have to do is pay attention to what is the value of that middle term, that negative 2x. Well, it's negative. So I need to figure out how can I make 1x and 3x equal negative 2x, either by adding them or subtracting them. So my last term is negative. So the only way, remember I'm multiplying 1 times 3 to get to 3. So the only way that I can get negative 3 is if one or the other of them is negative. Because remember, a negative times a positive is a negative. So, but then I also have to worry about which one, when I add or subtract them, gives me negative 2. Well, I know I'm going to use these two numbers. So let's think about that. I want to multiply them so that I get negative 3, but I want to add or subtract them so that I get negative 2. Well, how about negative 3 plus 1x? Does that give me negative 2x? It does, and 1 times negative 3 gives me negative 3. So I'm going to put negative 3x right there. I'm going to make the 3 negative, and I'm going to put a positive 1x right there. So now I'm going to go over to this box, and I'm going to find the GCF of the first row. So remember, rows are horizontal, columns are vertical. So the first row has x squared and negative 3x. Well, the GCF of those two numbers is just x. That's the only thing they have in common. So then I go down to the second row that has x and negative 3. Well, the only thing they have in common is 1. So I put a 1 right there. Then I go to the first column, which is x squared and x, and their GCF is x. And then I go to the next column, and I look at negative 3x and negative 3, and they have negative 3 in common. So now I've just factored that. I factored it into x minus 3 times x plus 1. Well, remember, one of those two things has to equal 0, so x equals 3 or x equals negative 1. So now we've just solved our first quadratic. Let's go to our next example. So here I have solved by factoring. 0 equals x squared minus 8x plus 15. I put the first term in the top left box. I put the last term in the bottom right box. So I have x squared and I have 15. Then I come over here to the side. I multiply them together. So x squared times 15 is 15x squared. Now I just start listing the factors of 15x squared. I always start with 1 and the number. Now 2 doesn't go into 15, but 3 does. So 3 goes into 15 5 times. And then I have to look at 4. Does 4 go into 15? It doesn't. And then I'm at 5 already, so I'm done. So now I just have to look at which one of those will combine to give me negative 8. Now, this is where we got to be a little bit creative. Remember, the last number is plus 15. It's a positive 15. Well, there are two ways I can get a positive number when I multiply. Either they're both positive or they're both negative. Well, since the 8x is negative, I need them both to be negative. So which combination, the 1 and the 15 or the 3 and the 5, will give me 8? Well, it's the 3 and the 5, but I need it to be negative 8. So both of them have to be negative. So there's 3x and there's a negative 5x. So I have negative 3x, negative 5x. Doesn't matter which box I put the negative 3x and the negative 5x in. Nope, they can go in either box. It doesn't matter. It'll still all work out in the end. The process is the same. So now I'm going to look at the first row and I'm going to ask myself, what does x squared and negative 3x have in common? Well, I did the column first. I'm sorry. X squared minus 5x has an x in common, and then negative 3x and 15 has a negative 3 in common. That goes into both of them. Now I'm going to look at the rows, and that has an x in common, and the second one has their common factor is negative 5. So I have x minus 3 times x minus 5. That should equal 0. So one of those has to be 0. So x is going to be 3 or x is going to be 5. And now we've solved our second quadratic. Let's take a look at our last example. Solve by factoring 0 equals 3x squared plus 13x plus 4. There goes the 3x squared in that column, or in that box. There goes the 4 in that box. I come over here, I multiply them together. 12x squared, 3 times 4 is 12. I start listing the factors. 1x, 12x. 2 goes in there 6 times. 3 goes in there 4 times. Now, 3 and 4 are right next to each other, so I don't need to check any more numbers. So now everything is positive up there. The 4 is positive, the 13 is positive, so I just need the pair of numbers that are going to add up to 13. Well, it looks like 1 and 12 are my best option. So I'm going to come over here and put 1x, and I'm going to put 12x right here. Factor out their common factors. There's an x, there's a 4, there's a 3x, so be careful on that, and there's a 1. And so I factored them. It's 3x plus 1, x plus 4. That should equal 0, so one of those two equals 0. So x either equals negative 1/3 or x equals negative 4. So now I am going to have you do some practice on these problems. The practice is actually posted in Alex, so you'll need to log into Alex, and the assignment should be there for you to see. And you can you can go through it, attempt it as many times as you want. So, make sure that you're getting a passing grade on it, which is you need to get at least a 60%. I would try to do better if I were you, so go through so that you really understand it, because this factoring is not going away. We're going to keep on using it for everything else that we're going to do. It's a really important topic, so practice, 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 and redo them until you can get them right. So this ends the lesson on how to solve quadratics by factoring. Have a great day, and don't forget to do the assignment.